The Orillia Museum of Art and History is located on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe. The Anishinaabe include the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi nations, collectively known as the Three Fires Confederacy. We respect and observe the long and enduring presence of Indigenous peoples, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit on this land. Their teachings and stewardship, culture, and way of life have shaped our city's unique identity.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Hannah Arndt, and I am the History Programming Coordinator here at OMAH. Thank you, everyone, for coming out tonight and supporting our History Speaker Series. Tonight, we have the excellent John Smith. As always, I want to also acknowledge Deanne McCullum-Rogers for sharing the OMA Speaker Series on Rogers Cable. Before television, YouTube, Netflix, and the like, there was CFOR radio, a mainstay in many homes here in Orillia. CFOR gave residents of Orillia and the supporting areas their weather, sports, news, and entertainment. Gordon Smith founded CFOR in 1945, assembling a vibrant team that brought innovation, fun, and top-notch local reporting to Orillia's airwaves. His son, John Smith, returns to share highlights from CFOR's colorful history, peppered with unforgettable moments and stories. John himself pursued his own passion for music, studying at Queen's University before embarking on a 30-year career in education. He retired as a secondary school principal, but remains deeply connected to Orillia's history, especially the rich legacy for CFOR and its impact on the community. As always, there will be a Q&A period at the end of the talk, so have your questions ready. John, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Okay, thank you for the opportunity to speak about CFOR this evening. It's a subject very near and dear to my heart, as I literally grew up there. We lived right behind the station, and I was over there after school almost every day. I even had a job. I was in charge of sharpening pencils and emptying ashtrays. Good child-friendly work, wouldn't you say? CFOR was founded and owned for its first 20 years by my dad, Gordon Smith. A farm boy from Rockton, Ontario, he was a mostly self-taught musician. As a teenager, he performed live after school every afternoon, singing and playing guitar on a Kitchener radio station, calling himself the Canadian woodchopper. This led to a series of other positions at stations in Brantford, Hamilton, and later in North Bay. Along the way, he married my mother, Jean, who followed and supported him for the rest of her life. In 1943, at the ripe old age of 25, Dad and his cousin-in-law, Alex Mitchell, founded their own station, CHPS, in Parry Sound. The youngest radio station owners in Canada, they acquired an already dated 250-watt transmitter from a Hamilton station and quickly gained a faithful audience base. In ideal conditions, the signals would have had a range of just a few miles. It was a small operation with Dad and Alex actively involved in every aspect of the business, including announcing, reporting, selling ads, or spots, as they were then known.
John, sorry to interrupt. We can't see your screen. May you share your screen so that we can see your photos?
Okay, well, it says I'm screen sharing. Okay.
That's okay. You want to read?
Okay.
Oh, somebody says they can see it. Hold on.
Oh,
never mind. Maybe
Parry Sound. Great.
Are we good to go?
Yep.
Okay.
Thank you.
No problem. As the war wound down in late 1944 and early 45, it became clear that Parry Sound, bustling with a huge munitions plant, was going to slow down dramatically. Alex recognized that his strengths were not in radio, and so Dad, on his own, applied to the CRTC to move the station to Orillia, a vibrant blue-collar community with a forward-looking mayor and council. In September of 1945, CFOR went on air using that same old 250-watt transmitter shown here. I love this one. The signal broadcasted from the top of a kind of utility pole tripod that Orillia Water, Light and Power provided without cost beside West Street South. And years later, my dad said, jokingly, he said, "I hope they don't bill me for it now." I apologize for the poor quality of this picture, but it's the only one I have of the original studio located upstairs on Main Street over a Loblaw store. Initially, they broadcast at 1430 megahertz, same as CHPS had been, but soon switched to 1570, where they were almost completely on their own in the upper end of the broadcasting spectrum. Dad quickly gathered together a team of announcers, technicians, reporters, salesmen, and office staff. In those early days of radio, and with a few notable exceptions, it was a young person's world. In this picture, we see the staff at Christmas 1950 posing with one of Dad's antique cars. You can see that it's a young, pretty happy-looking group. Many CFOR alumni have talked about how much fun it was to work there. Fairly early on, the offices and studio were moved to a spot over top of Wright's Cleaners, where Apple Annie's is now. Here we see the piano being hoisted into place. Dad always wanted there to be the provision for live music, and in his time, there was lots of it. And here's inside the office, a shot of Dad at his desk, and I happen to know this was taken on April 2nd, 1951, the day after I was born. It seems the place was decorated for the occasion. The transmitter was also moved to a site on Highway 12 South and a proper broadcasting tower erected. It was where Lazy Acres RV Sales and the Ramera Library are now located. I've called this presentation CFOR the best in community radio, and it was exactly that. They covered every aspect of life in Orillia and well beyond, including politics, openings, fires, accidents, concerts, sports, weather, traffic, you name it, they covered it. A small crew of an announcer and a techie was regularly sent to report on and often record any event of note, including using a primitive wire recorder in the earliest years. In this shot, you see announcer Pete McGarvey and the techie of the day, my grandfather, Harry Smith, with the station vehicle, a 1950 Pontiac panel delivery purchased from Clark Motors. Now, Grandpa was right at home on a John Deere tractor, but you know, I have real difficulty imagining him in charge of broadcasting equipment. The first station vehicle was actually this Jeep, not exactly an all-season resource. Early on, perhaps when the transmitter was moved to Ramera, the venerable old 250-watt transmitter was retired to a spot in a small shed and replaced by a 1,000-watt system. And here's a shot of young Peter Rowe monitoring the transmitter. Peter started working part-time at the station at the age of 13 and was a whiz at anything electronic. He soon became a full-time employee, and he could have never found a more dedicated one. When the station was sold, the new owners did not feel the need to keep things from the past. So many recordings, pictures, and documentation were destroyed. Sensing that they might someday be valued, Peter rescued quite a few bits and pieces, upon some of which my presentation this evening is based. This added dramatically, the increased wattage added dramatically to the station's catchment area, with the signal reaching places as far away as Gravenhurst, Pefferlaw, Edgar, and Victoria Harbour. Earlier, I mentioned the youthfulness of the staff, but there were exceptions, perhaps most notably a salesman named Alex Gilmore, seen here. Growing up, he was a farm boy from Uphill, Four Corners hamlet on the Monk Road beyond Seabright. By the time he came to work at CFOR, he was a very personable middle-aged man, slow-moving, but with a twinkle in his eye and always a story to tell. He was a quintessential salesman, charming countless business owners over a wide radius of Orillia into buying spot ads. One of the regulars was Bodley's General Store in Pefferlaw. Another was Miller Motors in Brecon, whose spots always concluded with, "You always get a break in Brecon." Cold water businesses got, "You get a warm welcome in cold water." Some advertisers got their own jingle, created by my dad. There was an Austin dealer on Lackley Street known as Green Gables Garage, seen here in a picture that Marcel Rousseau found for me. Their jingle went like this. "I went to Green Gables and bought me a car. You bet it's an Austin and better by far. With a high cost of living and other expense, the money you're saving makes jolly good sense." There was a chorus too, but I can't remember all the words. And here's how one for Clark Motors Goodwill used cars started. "Goodwill used cars, Goodwill used cars. They cost less money, they're better by far." At a CFOR alumni party a few years ago, Gordon Lightfoot said that he wrote a jingle for Booth's Furniture and Appliances of Hawkstone and never got paid for it. And yes, Gordon Lightfoot was first heard on CFOR. I think his broadcasting career began as a very talented boy soprano soloist with the St. Paul's United Church Choir when a Sunday morning service was being aired on the station. In 1955, ground was broken for a state-of-the-art facility at 241 West Street North, where Orillia Orthodontics is now. You might notice that the sign says Radio and Television Studios. Dad thought he was going to get a license for a TV station, but somehow that went to Barrie and became CKBB Channel 3. Here's the completed building. The top floor had a reception area and offices for Dad, sales, bookkeeping, and copier script writing, mostly for commercials. On their regular programs, the announcers pretty much ad-libbed the whole time. Downstairs is where the radio happened. In addition to a record library and news director Bob Douglas's office, there were 2 studios with a control room between them. The person in the control room was the operator. Well-known radio personalities Taylor Parnaby, Keith Elshaw, and Frank Allenson all got their starts at that console. In one of the studios, there were a grand piano and Hammond organ. There was a whole lot of live music coming from that studio, often with Dad on the Hammond and staff member Mark McFarland on the piano. Large windows in each studio looked out into the rest of the production area, and there were many pranks pulled by other staff members attempting to break up the announcers while they were on air. I keep saying it was a fun place to work. A word about religious broadcasting. In those days, Orillia was pretty much a church-going community with most churches thriving. Dad set up Sunday morning live broadcasts from local churches, starting with Bethel Baptist. And when the other churches realized how popular it was with audiences, they wanted their own pieces of the action too. Soon a number of hours each week were devoted to religious broadcasting. This is an ad from the Packet and Times where Bethel Baptist listed its many programs, and you may not be able to read the column on the right, but it's all examples of fan mail they received from American listeners as far south as Atlanta, Georgia. It wasn't just church services that filled the time devoted to religious broadcasting. Here's a shot of Pete McGarvey introducing the Pilgrim Singers, a duo of older ladies who, with an accompanist, harmonized on extremely traditional Christian tunes. Their performances, by today's standards, maybe weren't all that slick. Dad was a very creative person, always full of ideas, and he encouraged his staff to explore all possibilities. As a result, there were some very innovative initiatives at CFOR. For example, the Women's Show. If you knew my mother, seen here in her kitchen, you might not have imagined her as a radio personality, but sometimes still waters run deep. In CFOR's very early days, she was Nora North from Northways, a small department store on the main street. I don't know how they managed it, but she was able to broadcast live from her kitchen, this kitchen, on Colburn Street, where she was also supervising my brother Paul, infant sister Linda, and Tiny, the family dog. Everything would go well until someone came to the door, or the mailman shoved letters through the slot, causing the dog to go nuts, or the phone would ring, or the baby would cry. And we thought working from home was something new. Here are station engineer George Slynn, and at that time, his assistant, Peter Rowe. Together, they were able to come up with some pretty amazing technology. For example, on busy days in the summer, when the studio was still over Wright's Cleaners, they would lower a mic out the window to street level, and an announcer would interview random tourists and locals passing by. Later on, Dad bought a medium-sized travel trailer, and George and Peter converted it to a mobile studio sponsored by 7-Up. It was hauled by this 1941 Ford cab-over engine that had been formerly owned by Otaco, used for taking their equipment to fairs and other events. And I actually wish I had that truck now. It had been gently used and it ran like a top. On Friday nights, the mobile studio would be put into position in the parking lot at the Sundial Restaurant, right beside Highway 11 North. A pair of announcers would spin records and kibitz in a program called Rolling North. Motorists passing by would toot horns or flash lights if they were listening in. By the way, the announcers typically feasted on Kentucky Fried Chicken from the Sundial, which was one of the first KFC franchises in Canada. Once a year, CFOR hosted the Kiwanis Radio Auction, where local merchants donated items to be auctioned off as a fundraiser for Kiwanis causes. It was a really popular event, and it helped the service club bring in a large amount of money. My mother-in-law successfully bid on this oil painting of the Foxmead Church in the 1960 auction. For some years, CFOR had an association with the CBC and produced a program called Dominion Barn Dance. Staged with live audiences in halls throughout the listening area, it was aired coast to coast. I believe this picture was taken at one of the shows, and I also feel the musicians are a group called the Calgary Range Riders. Periodically, Dad would sit in with them, playing string bass or singing, as is shown here. Stan Lark, the announcer who hosted these shows, reported receiving 200 to 300 letters per week from delighted audiences. By the way, Gordon Lightfoot credits CFOR with his first appearance on national radio. He and 3 high school buddies, known as the Collegiate Four, were guests on Dominion Barn Dance. On summer weekends, there were regular reports from the Rothman Courtesy Cruiser, a 26-foot Goliath with an inboard engine. Often the reporting team consisted of my brother Paul at the wheel and Barry Norman at the mic. They ambled around Lake Couchiching and the north end of Simcoe, interviewing boaters and fishermen, making regular reports that were aired live. It all went well until one day the boat exploded just off the dock of a marina at the Narrows, blasting Paul and Barry into the water. Neither was seriously injured, and fortunately both could swim well. There was a blower system to evacuate gasoline fumes from the engine hold, and it either malfunctioned or was not turned on before startup. Undaunted, Dad simply replaced the boat with another one, this time slightly bigger. There were regular daily or weekly features that had tremendous audiences. At 1 o'clock each weekday, listeners tuned into Let's Swap, where items or services could be posted for sale or wanted. It was a favorite time for staff pranks. Kay Leahy, she was later Kay Foreman, seen here, typed up the script and periodically slipped in a doozy designed to trick unsuspecting announcers into reading it on air. One such ad indicated a local politician had 24 post holes for sale to be removed upon purchase. People would also have made sure to be listening at 12:55 noon or 6:55 p.m. every day to hear the funeral directory. Framed by ponderous phrases from Handel's famous Largo, announcers would read out the death notices and funeral details of the recently deceased. To this day, I can't hear that piece of music without thinking of the funeral directory. This leads me to talk about my mother, no longer Nora North, but she became the unofficial quality control officer. The radio was always on at home while she pursued her daily routines, and she kept an ear ready to catch any mistakes or gaffes. She was particularly vigilant during the funeral directory. One day she was appalled to hear the announcer say, "We are sorry that there are no funerals to report." In another case, Fred Merritt, a really jolly guy, stumbled over a name and heartily laughed. She reported all these misdemeanors to my dad for action. Mom and Dad hosted staff parties a couple of times a year, and they were legendary events. With lots of food and alcoholic beverages, they became raucous affairs. Romances sometimes began, but at least one marriage ended with someone running down the center of Highway 11 with a carload of CFOR staff members driving beside her, encouraging her to stop running and get in the car. Here's a shot of the staff from a party in about 1958, taken in the rec room of our Dalton Crescent home. And in this one, everybody looks pretty well behaved. This might be a good time to talk about famous CFOR alumni. I've mentioned Gordon Lightfoot, never an actual employee, but there's a long list of people who went on to become very well known across Canada and well beyond. How many of us watched The Friendly Giant? Actor Rod Coneybeare got his start in Orillia before moving on to the CBC, where he soon became the voices and puppeteer for Rusty and Jerome on that show. Author Richard Wright also had a short stint here. Taylor, or Hap Parnaby as we knew him, went on to become one of the most trusted newscasters in the GTA. Here he is at age 13, just 1 year before he became an after-school operator at CFOR. And here he is again as a young newscaster at Chum Toronto. Pete McGarvey, seen on the right during an interview, stayed as long as Dad owned the station, but eventually he too became an extremely successful Toronto radio personality. Ken, or Jigs McDonald, went on to do play-by-play for NHL teams, eventually receiving the Foster Hewitt Award for hockey broadcasting from the Hockey Hall of Fame. Let me talk a bit more about Jigs. He grew up in the village of Ayr, near Cambridge, and came to Orillia as a young single man, not much more than a teenager. He was immediately popular as the station's sportscaster. One day, he was introduced to Marilyn Thompson, a young red-headed woman who had just been hired as receptionist and was being shown around the facility. To quote Jigs, "She was the most beautiful person I had ever seen." Soon a romance began. They were married, and Dad drove them from the church in an antique car. Marilyn and Ken were one of several couples who met at CFOR. Jigs got his start in sportscasting doing the play-by-play for the Orillia Bulldozers and later the Terriers. and developed the necessary skills to do the same in the NHL. But he wasn't the only great sportscaster who got his start at CFOR. Another was Barry Norman, who also came to the station as a young single guy. He met Dorothy, the love of his life, in Orillia, though not at CFOR. Like Jigs, he was incredibly good at sportscasting, the voice of the Orillia Terriers for many years. Not long after Jigs went to the NHL, Barry was asked to apply to the Buffalo Sabres when they were looking for a play-by-play guy. Ultimately, Barry and Dorothy decided this lifestyle demanded by the NHL was not for them. Every evening, starting at 7, Lefty Williams signed on with, "This is your Hillbilly Jamboree," after which the Orange Blossom Special took it away. At night, Lefty was heard over an incredibly wide area, including Northern Ontario and way down in the United States. As you might imagine, he played only country and western music, introducing each song with some down-home style banter. Lefty, whose real name was Frank Skelton, was outside radio, maybe a little shy, but give him a guitar to play or a show to host, and he became Mr. Personality. His sponsor was Hanna Motors, a Ford dealership with a modest operation consisting of a small office and separate service garage on Front Street, about where Sunshine Car Wash is located now. They had a big sign out front featuring a huge letter H. Lefty referred to his sponsor as Cousin Hannah from the Big H Motors and encouraged his listeners to come to Orillia for great deals on new and used Fords. And people did come, a lot of them. And I've often wondered what Lefty's listeners thought when they actually saw the small car lot with maybe 4 new cars and a dozen used ones on offer. The Hillbilly Jamboree played for years, only stopping when the new ownership took over. It wasn't all sweetness and light at CFOR. On the night of May 13th, 1957, Dad watched helplessly as a transmitter station burned to the ground in a fire started by a disgruntled young man. However, within hours, Peter Rowe and George Slynn were able to fire up that old 250-watt transmitter, now at least 30 years old, and connect it into the system. It held down the fort until a new building and equipment could be built and equipment purchased. The fire took its toll on Dad. He liked people, and he wanted people to like him, and he was surprised to be the target of someone's anger. In response to another disaster, Hurricane Hazel, in October 1954, CFOR was able to keep broadcasting, I think they went 24 hours a day, actually, for a few days. This picture shows an Orillia area scene from the aftermath of the storm. I think the studios and production area were somewhat flooded by the torrential rain, but staff literally bailed the studio out. They later received a national award for exemplary service for their efforts. Here's a shot of the new transmitter building, which was constructed after the fire. Incidentally, it's framed by stories and pictures of operator Pearl Graham and news director Bob Douglas. Not long after these pictures were taken, Pearl and Bob became an item and were later married. Take a look at this Christmas card, created by local graphic artist Ken Woodhouse. Each staff member held a pose for a few minutes while Ken doodled with an index finger on the palm of his other hand. He then went home and created the artwork for the card. Especially with the men, he really captured their likenesses with exaggerated physical features. My grandfather is bottom row, second from the left, and it's absolutely him. If you knew Pete McGarvey, you'll see him bottom row, fourth from the right. Or Peter Rowe, bottom row, second from the right. Coincidentally, Dad and Ken Woodhouse were both inducted into the Orillia Hall of Fame on the same day, just a few years ago. Oh, there we go. Sorry. Ken had a good sense of humor. I hope you'll forgive a little bit of his cheekiness in this cartoon of Alex Gilmore speaking to my dad about a sponsor, Klutz's Nuts. To change the subject, here's a publicity shot of a young announcer whose name escapes me. And a few more shots of staff members. That's Bob Douglas, top left, with Pete McGarvey beside him. And I don't know the names of the other folks in that picture. We've got Joan Upton, she was later Joan Grant on the left, and Russ Waters and Nancy Brandon, and I'm sorry that I don't know the lady on the right. And here's a pretty glamorous looking guy who was a staff member at CFOR back in the early days. In preparation for this evening, I made a list of possible events or stories that could be told. In talking the list over with my wife, Susan, she said, "You're not going to talk about Bob Hope?" I noted that I wrote a story about it for Mariposa Exposed, so I didn't see the need to cover it again. She convinced me otherwise, so here we go. In early September 1957, they increased the signal for the station from 5,000 watts to 10,000, a cause that was felt for celebration. And indeed it was. It was one of the very few radio stations in Ontario, even in Canada, that had that power, a signal with that power. At a management meeting in late August, they were discussing possible plans. Someone said jokingly, "Well, Bob Hope's playing at the CNE. Why don't we ask him?" Dad said, "Hey, I know Bert Powell, the CEO of the CNE. I'll ask him how to get hold of Bob Hope." Bert obliged by telling him that Bob was staying at the Royal York. So Dad called the hotel and was put right through to Bob's room. Bob himself answered the phone. He listened politely to the request that he come to Orillia for a day, then said, "Well, sounds good, but can I bring my family? We're all here. And also, do you think we could go fishing after the event?" Dad said, "Sure." Days later, Bob, his wife Dolores, and 4 kids arrived in Orillia. As you can imagine, there had been a lot of publicity and excitement was running high. A stage had been built in front of the station and a big switch rigged up. And I think, in fact, Bob's holding the switch in this picture. Before the event, a couple of things happened. First of all, the Smith and Hope families met and posed for this picture. I'm not sure where my brother Paul was, but that's me with my little jacket and bow tie down in the front row. The Hopes were charming people. Their kids were each movie star good looking in their own right, and they were all dressed in timelessly fashionable clothing. My mother, on the other hand, had an airplane propeller on her hat. He was presented with a number of gifts, including a caricature by Ken Woodhouse. Next up was a parade down the main street with Bob Hope in the 1912 Tud Hope, which he joked about. He even tried to drive it, but that didn't go well. Staff member Nancy Brandon is at the wheel in this picture. It was a Thursday in the first week of school, and everyone at the high school across the road from the station knew Bob Hope was going to appear. There was so much pandemonium that finally Principal Mort Winch caved and let school out for a couple of hours. In those days, there was a row of maple trees alongside West Street. They were soon full of teenagers, vying for a better view of the proceedings. Altogether, there were thousands of people looking on. It was a really big deal. Bob improvised a comedy monologue before throwing the switch over to 10,000 watts. Wasn't a great time for me, though. I was given the task of giving flowers to Mrs. Hope. Dutifully, I walked out on stage carrying a large bouquet of red roses and presented them. But then, horror of horrors for a 6-year-old boy, she kissed me right in front of all those people. Mortified, I ran off stage and back home where I hid out in my bedroom. But things went on without me, and after the event concluded, the Hope family were taken by R.W. Phelps and his wife on Capri, their wonderful big Chris Craft cabin cruiser. The kids tried their hand at fishing, but Bob asked if he could stretch out in the cabin, where he enjoyed a very restful nap. The Hopes exchanged Christmas cards with my folks for quite a few years after that. Such wonderful people. Sometime in early 1964, we were having supper as usual, but Dad, normally light-hearted and full of smart remarks and teasing, said he had something that he wanted to discuss with us. Someone wanted to buy CFOR. And before making the decision to sell, he wanted to talk it over with us, the family. At the time, I was 13, my sister 19, and brother 23. Paul was working at the station at the time, but he was ready to spread his wings. I wasn't emptying ashtrays anymore, but still really wasn't involved. Linda was studying to be a visual artist. My memory tells me that we gave him the go-ahead to sell pretty much right on the spot. For my part, it was a decision that I later somewhat regretted, but in reality, it was a time when Canadian broadcasters had to get big or go home. And I think, while Dad could have found financing to buy the Midland, Huntsville, and Lindsay stations, all of which were more or less available, but that would have been a huge undertaking. And I think that Dad, being the creative type he was ready for a new challenge. He sold the operation to Great Lakes Broadcasting, an arm of McLean Hunter. There were many changes made when the new owners took over. Gone were religious broadcasting, Lefty Williams, Let's Swap, and the funeral directory. It was still good community-based radio, though. Over the years, it has changed hands a number of times. In 1993, it evolved into Kix FM at 105.9, where it continues to be heard today. Well, that about wraps up my presentation tonight, but I'd like to share one more little story with you. When I was a little kid, I loved Christmas and was quite taken with Santa Claus. For a couple of weeks before the big day, CFOR had a late afternoon Santa Claus show featuring Santa himself, Mrs. Claus, Gnot the Gnome, Rudolph, and other characters. If I was on after-school ashtray duty, Dad would seek me out and tell me to go home and listen from there. I was delighted to hear that show, most especially Santa's jovial voice, which I found comforting and somehow familiar. Years later, and I mean years later, I learned that Mrs. Claus was Marg McFarland, Pete McGarvey was Gnot the Gnome, Ken McDonald was probably Rudolph, and my dad was Santa. It still makes me smile to think how those talented CFOR personalities spun a story that was utterly believable for a young boy. I should have said at the beginning of this that OMA initially asked Rusty Draper to speak about CFOR, but at the time he was having a few health issues. He's doing much better now, and maybe he and other post-Gord Smith folks could take this story further. But I had a blast putting it together, and I hope it brought a few smiles and an appreciation for the many contributions CFOR made to the wider Orillia community. During my dad's time, the station signed off every night with a reading of The Day Is Done by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. It's a long poem, and they use the whole thing each time. But I'd like to conclude by offering three verses. The day is done, and darkness falls from the wings of night, as a feather is wafted downward from an eagle in his flight. I see the lights of the village gleam through the rain and the mist, and a feeling of sadness comes o'er me, that my soul cannot resist. And the night shall be filled with music, and the cares that infest the day shall fold their tents like the Arabs and as silently steal away. Thank you.
Thank you, John. That was wonderful. If anybody has any questions for John, you can start typing them now, but we've got some really good just anecdotes in the comments as well. John, I can read them out for you.
Sure.
Diane Clipsham says, I also played Beethoven on the piano at the request of my teacher, Gertrude Lambert. She taught many, including Gordy, I believe, Lightfoot. And she also mentions in the photo of the four boys, the one is Bobby, pardon me if I mispronounced the name, Croxall or Croxall.
Yeah.
Yeah. Dave Moore says, here at the funeral announcements from Orillia and area. And Kay Randall says, the unidentified announcer was George Franks.
Oh, okay.
Dave also says, great job, John. I have wonderful memories of working there during the much later telemedia days. Don't see any questions yet, but I did have a question for you.
Okay.
Do you still listen to radio, or do you kind of think it's too different nowadays?
I do listen to radio. In fact, I listen to radio quite a bit. And I actually feel that that in its own way, CBC offers some pretty good community radio on their Ontario morning program and, well, a lot of their programs. And so yeah, I listen to radio. I really enjoy it.
Awesome. Anybody has any questions? Let me know. I have another question too. Do you find yourself also listening to podcasts or the like? Because I find, they might be very similar to the old radio, not like what television shows would have been, but for the radio. Do you find yourself listening to those as well?
Well, it's funny you should ask that. We had a little family excursion last weekend, and our daughter was with us, and she's more technically savvy than her mother and I are. And anyway, so she got us going on being able to listen to podcasts in the car. And so I'm already enjoying that. And yeah, I love podcasts.
Yeah, CBC has great ones too, if I can recommend some. I got some questions. Do you remember the visit of Princess Elizabeth and the Duke of Edinburgh in 59?
I do. I was standing on a balcony beside my little buddy Bob Parnaby, Hap's brother, Taylor Parnaby's brother. And anyway, Prince Philip looked up at us and waved. I mean, he was waving at us, for sure.
Kevin Stewart says, thank you for the interesting background. I was there in the mid-'80s and learned a lot then about the value of community-based radio. Dave Moore also says, it seems odd driving past the West Street station and not seeing CFOR there anymore. How do you feel passing by there?
Well, I've got so many happy memories that it makes me smile.
Well said. Another great job, John. I have fond memories of being in the booth with Keith Elshaw. Don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. Yeah, when he was broadcasting, we would always slip in some trumpet recordings.
Who was that?
I'm not sure, just his iPad.
Oh, darn. It's probably somebody I knew.
Oh, doing a broadcast of their tour around town, they ran over my toes. That was Kay Randall. Oh. Wayne Tyndale.
Well, Wayne Tyndale.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
He's my roommate, one of my roommates at university. So, yeah.
Oh, really sweet. Okay. I found one question. Ron Nash asks, have we lost something with the loss of family-owned radio stations?
Well, yeah, I kind of think so. I mean, I think it's like a lot of things. When the decision making leaves a community, I think something's lost. Um, and so I think, I mean, I don't want to sound like I'm down on all big corporations or anything like that, but I think you do kind of lose that personal approach and that ability to kind of custom tailor things to a particular community. And that applies to radio, but a lot of other things as well.
Uh, Jessica had a question. She says, what do you think your father would say about how radio or media in general has changed today? I think that's very similar to Ron's question.
Um, well, I think he'd be, my dad, when he was a young man, he was a real innovator. Like he liked new technology. And, at the end of his life, he struggled with a computer and so on. But he really enjoyed a challenge. And I think that he would have been like if he was sort of entering radio now as a young man, he would love all those technological, things that you can do. Um, and so, yeah, I think he would definitely approve of that. I think he would he would like there to be, that personal approach. I mean, it was it was all about that for him.
She also had another question that says, have you come across any rare audio recordings or artifacts from CFOR that really surprised you?
Well, I have, and actually, if I were a little bit more technically literate or technologically literate, I could have maybe included them, a few of them. But there actually are. I came across some sound clips of commercials and little bits of programs and so on. And there's some great um, audio footage of Barry Norman doing play-by-play for one of it'd be the Orillia Terriers. And yeah, so there are some little bits and pieces.
I don't see any more questions. So I'm going to pass it off to Jessica. Again, thank you, John, so much. I really loved the presentation and thank you.
Okay.
Thanks, John, for such a heartfelt and fascinating look into the history of CFOR and Orillia's golden age of radio. And thanks to everyone who joined us tonight. Whether you tuned in for nostalgia, curiosity, or local pride, we're glad to have shared this evening with you.